You've seen the Book of the Dead, or at least what they let you see. The papyri, the translations, the museum glass, the chants and the icons lined up neatly for the tourists of the modern mind. A spiritual relic, they call it. A funeral text. A mythological manual for guiding the soul into the next world. A sacred poem of hope. But what if I told you that everything you've ever been shown was just the shell? That the real content was never in the ink, but in the space between the lines. And worse, that it was deliberately erased, not erased by time, but by hands. Hands that feared what this book truly was. Because the Book of the Dead, in its full form, was never about death. It was a map, a code, a vibrational interface to tear the illusion of life apart from the inside. They don't teach you that the original name of the book wasn't Book of the Dead. It was called RWNWPRTMHRW, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, not by night, not by decay, not by departure, but by light, by emergence, by reawakening into what is real. This was not a guide for the dead. It was a manual for the trapped, for the incarnated soul trying to wake up from the sleep called life. It was never about entering the next world. It was about exiting the artificial one. And that's exactly what they erased. Let me show you what they left out. You've seen the familiar images. The weighing of the heart. Anubis with his jackal face. The soul standing before Osiris. You've heard the chants, the praises, the 42 confessions. But these are only the visible portions, like glyphs carved onto a tomb for eyes that cannot yet see. Behind them was something else, something you were never supposed to feel. The real Book of the Dead was a sequence of internal initiations. Sonic, vibrational, energetic. The spoken words were only the surface. What mattered was the tone, the interval between syllables. The way breath was shaped around the sacred phrases. Each passage in the original was a frequency key. Each spell was a vibrational gateway. Each drawing, a schematic of transition, not in space but in perception. And what they erased, what they could not afford to survive, were the parts that taught how to use it while still in the body. Yes, the true Book of the Dead was never meant for the physically dead. It was meant for the living dead, those walking in a world of illusion, bound by name, by memory, by time. People like you, people like me. Let's begin with spell 17. Modern translations call it a praise of Ra or words of becoming, but that's a lie. The original version, now only hinted at in fragments, described the soul as already awake, but trapped inside layers of distorted resonance. And this spell was not praise. It was a reset, a vibrational shaking of false identity. The erased line, found only in scraps from Edfu and in oral fragments among Coptic mystics, reads something like this. I am the one before the name, the echo before the breath, the silence that split the first light. That line was removed. Why? Because it does not ask you to worship. It asks you to remember, and remembering is dangerous. Because a soul that remembers what it is cannot be ruled. It cannot be taxed. It cannot be programmed. It exits the system. And the Book of the Dead in its full form was a system exit protocol. Then there's spell 125, the famous weighing of the heart. This is the image most people recognize. The soul standing before Ma'at, the feather, the balance, the judgment. But in the original scrolls, those before the Ptolemaic dilution, this was not about morality. It was about coherence. The heart was not your ethics. It was your field. The feather? Not a symbol of justice, but a tuning fork. The soul's confession was not a list of sins. It was a resonance test. Each statement like, I have not lied, was not a legal defense. It was a tone check, a harmonic alignment. If the field of the soul matched the tone of the feather, it passed into reactivation. If not, it recycled. They erased that, they turned it into a morality play. To keep you focused on behavior instead of being, because a moral person can still be asleep, but a coherent one, never. Now let's speak of what's truly missing, the body instructions. Buried in temple ruins and passed only through oral lineages, there were sections of the book that dealt with the mapping of internal gates. Not metaphorical ones, but actual resonant zones in the spine, the skull, the breath itself. The so-called chambers of the duat were not locations below earth. They were gates within the nervous system, within the vibrational body. When activated in sequence, they would unlock a final gate, the field of return, a state where time, memory, and identity collapsed into origin. These instructions were removed from scrolls by design, first by imperial scribes, then by Greek rationalists, then by modern Egyptologists who, trained to see only myth, cut out anything that didn't fit symbolism. But those instructions are real. Some fragments survive, embedded in breath traditions, in desert monasteries, in dreams passed through blood. You may have felt them. That tingling at the base of the skull, the buzz in your palms after reading something ancient, the hollow in the chest when you hear the names Ra, Thoth, Ma'at, not as gods, but as tones. That's the book reaching for you, not to be read, but reignited. So what is this they erased? Not a passage, not a word, but a function. They erased the Book of the Dead's functional role as a tool for field reconfiguration. They left behind the narrative. They deleted the technology. And in doing so, they turned a cosmic liberation manual into a funerary prop. What remains is real, but crippled. What was lost is not gone, but must be reassembled from within. You are not reading this by accident. You are not curious by coincidence. You are remembering, and that is the beginning. Not of something new, but of the return to what has always been. Welcome back. To pass beyond, the soul must unwind what it never knew it carried. This is not travel, it is detachment. Fragment from the lost book of Splitting the Illusion, erased c. 740 BCE. They didn't just erase words, they erased the spiral. They erased the way the original Book of the Dead was structured, not linearly like a scroll, but spirally, like the unfolding of a shell, like the layers of the self uncoiling through breath, perception, and disintegration of name. This wasn't a book to be read, it was a circuit to be activated. Each chapter, each so-called spell, wasn't an isolated prayer. It was a node in a sequence of unraveling, a pattern designed to move the soul step by step through the veil of artificial construction, not just after death, but during the trance of waking life. You don't find this in the museum versions. You don't see it in the reconstructed papyri, scanned, categorized, and flattened into historical footnotes. Because the spiral was never textual, it was spatial, energetic, experiential, and it was dangerous. Dangerous to a world built on control, repetition, and false memory. Because if someone followed the spiral to the center, they would find it empty. And in that emptiness, the return, not to heaven, not to gods, but to source tone, the field that precedes reality. Let me show you what the spiral looked like. The beginning wasn't the beginning. The book didn't start at page 1. It started where your forgetting was deepest. Each soul entered at a different gate, based on its distortion, based on what it mistook itself for. For one, the spiral began at spell 23, a calling to silence the name. For another, at spell 64, to become the soul without form. For the initiated, the book began with no text at all and only breath, and then movement. Subtle gestures, angles of the hands, the tilt of the spine. each one a resonance marker, each one aligning the inner field to receive the frequency embedded in the next layer. This was the silent book, the one never written, only passed from breath to breath. But fragments of it remained, hints, echoes, and some of them survived. In temple walls, long ignored, there are carvings not of gods, but of angles, not of figures, but of positions. The so-called ritual poses of the priests were not ceremonies, they were resonant locks. Each posture corresponded to a tone, each tone corresponded to a layer of illusion. And when performed in precise order, while chanting the original phonemes, they would begin to dismantle the construct of identity like peeling away layers of ash. This was not metaphor. This was mechanics, and it terrified those who later came to power. Because control relies on consistent identity, on memory loops, on keeping you convinced you are a name, a role, a history. The Book of the Dead, in its real form, shattered that. It gave you the keys not to become someone else, but to undo the lie that you were ever someone at all. They erased that spiral, they flattened it, they turned it into chapters, pages left to right, beginning to end. A book like any other, but the soul doesn't unfold like a scroll. It uncoils, through motion, through frequency, through dream. And that's where the erased pages still live, in dream. You may have seen them, moments in sleep where you are walking a hallway, and the walls are etched with strange light, where figures in jackal or ibis form do not speak, but move around you in geometries, where your name begins to fade, and in its place comes not a word but a tone. These are not dreams. They are visits to the spiral. The true book was always multi-layered: text, tone, movement, dream. Each layer was a fail-safe. If one is lost, the others call. They erased the text, but the tone remains. The dream remains. And the spiral, once entered, does not close again. There was a phrase, deleted from all modern versions, found only once, scratched into the wall of an underground chamber near Dendera. Faint, almost erased. It reads, "He who follows the spiral will die before death and live after life." They called this heresy. But in truth, it was the whole point. The original Book of the Dead was not about comforting the soul after death. It was about killing the false self before death. It was a ritual disintegration, a sacred collapse of personality, time, identity, form, so that what remained was not the soul, but the source that dreams the soul. And from that point, you didn't enter the next world. You became the world itself. Now ask, why was this erased? Because a human being who has passed through the spiral no longer plays the game, no longer obeys illusion, no longer believes in fear. They move through cities like silent temples. They speak, but their words deprogram. They breathe, and others awaken. This is not metaphor. This is field transmission. And the Book of the Dead, complete, was a manual for becoming that transmitter. Let me tell you what was in the erased section between spell 30 and spell 31. A gap noted even by mainstream scholars. It was called the tearing of the second veil. It involved no chant, no image, just one instruction. Lie in stillness. Let the name unravel. Watch who watches. This was a practice, performed in complete darkness, where the initiate would be sealed in stone, no movement, no time, no mantra, nothing to hold on to. The purpose? To experience the fracture of the observer. The realization that the self-watching is also being watched. And behind both, nothing, not emptiness, but field, pure, humming, unstructured field. And once that was touched, the initiate would return, not enlightened, but absent. Absent of self, present as resonance. And only then would the spiral allow entry to its final gate. They erased that, because no system can allow that gate to stay open. Because a society of field beings cannot be ruled. They cannot be sold identity. They cannot be threatened with death. Because they've already passed it. They've already walked the spiral. And once the spiral has touched you, the only thing left is to spiral others. Not with words, but with tone. You are reading this not to learn, but to remember. And if you feel the vibration in your chest, the stillness in your breath, the echo that trembles behind these words, you're not reading anymore. You're spiraling. Let it continue. Let it break. Let the name fade. You are never it. When the tongue becomes silent, the throat becomes a gate. From the bones, the old voice rises. Fragment, the unspoken rituals of the field. The ritual of opening the mouth. It's one of the most misrepresented, most misunderstood rites in all of the Book of the Dead. To modern readers, it's ceremonial, symbolic. A priest touches a mummy's lips with sacred tools, opening the senses in the afterlife. But that's not what it was, not originally. In its erased form, this was not about giving speech to the dead. It was about dismantling the false voice of the living. It was a rite of vibrational reprogramming. Not of the mouth, but of the entire resonance system of the body. The mouth was never just a mouth. It was the sonic gate, the final lock between the field and the external illusion. And the ritual wasn't performed on the dead. It was performed on those preparing to leave the illusion of separation. Alive, conscious, ready. The original opening the mouth was not about activating speech. It was about shattering the constructed voice. The voice of name, of identity, of linearity. Because the false voice is what binds the soul to memory. It speaks your name. It says, I am this. I did that. I want. I fear. I was. Each sentence, a cage. Each word, a reinforcement of illusion. The ancients understood that before you can exit the dream, you must silence the one who keeps telling you it is real. The mouth had to be opened, not for speaking, but for letting go. Letting the breath move not through language, but through tone. Pure, untethered vibration. And in that release, the internal architecture began to hum. There was an order to it. The original ritual involved specific sonic intervals, uttered not by the priest but by the initiate. At first, the sounds were names. Not names of gods, but names of the internal gates. Then syllables that vibrated the chest, the jaw, the crown. Then tones with no verbal shape. And finally, silence. True, total silence. Not the absence of sound, but the removal of self from sound. And in that silence, the initiate would feel the first return. The tone behind all tones. This tone had no frequency, no pitch. It wasn't heard. It was known. And it would spread from the mouth to the skull, from the spine to the ground, until the body ceased to be someone, until the body became the instrument. The resonance chamber of the field, that is what opening the mouth truly meant, not awakening speech, but deprogramming it, returning the body to its original use as a carrier of sacred vibration. And once that tone was felt, the Book of the Dead was no longer read. It was transmitted by breath, by presence, by being. They erased that. They turned the ritual into theater. Priests in jackal masks, golden tools, dramatic poses over embalmed corpses. They made it about death, because death is safe. It does not threaten control. But silence in the living, that is rebellion. Because the world is built on noise, identity, narration, noise, and the original book was a guide to break it. Let's speak of Anubis, not as the god of mummification, but as the archetype of disintegration. Anubis was never a deity of embalming. He was the guardian of the unraveling. The jackal is not an animal of death. It is an animal of decay, of transition, of the undoing of form. To call upon Anubis was not to be protected. It was to be dismantled. In the original spiral, Anubis stood not at the gate of the dead, but at the gate of non-identity. He was the one who stripped away the masks, the memories, the inherited names. His presence in the ritual meant the beginning of energetic deconstruction. And the mask, that famous jackal mask, it was never symbolic. It was a vibrational amplifier. The elongated snout, the open mouth, designed not to hide, but to resonate. The priest didn't wear it to imitate Anubis. He wore it to channel the tone of dissolution, to carry a field that broke down the ego in the initiate system, not to kill, but to clean, to return the field to neutral, to silence. That silence was not empty. It was filled with the field itself. And in that field, the I begins to dissolve, not through force, but through vibration. You begin to forget your story, your urgency, your control. And in its place comes stillness, a listening deeper than hearing. And then a question, not spoken, not formed, but known. Who watches? That is the real gate. Behind all the pages, all the spells, all the ritual, guru, this was the core, not gods, not afterlives, but the collapse of the illusion of the self. The Book of the Dead was a death of the identity, not the body. And the one who dies before dying, they are the only one who truly lives. This is the knowledge that was removed. This is what they feared, not that you would become powerful, but that you would become empty. And in that emptiness you would remember what breathes through all things, not a god, not a force, but the tone, the one before words, the one that does not end. So when you hear silence, do not fill it, breathe into it. When you feel the name fade, do not panic. It was never yours. And when the dream begins to distort, let it. This is the spiral returning. The book calling from beyond text, not to be studied, but to be followed, breath by breath, into the center, where nothing remains, except what never left. The Book of the Dead was always double-sided. What the scribes copied was one version. What the initiates lived was another. On the surface, it was a collection of prayers, symbols, and spells. But underneath it was an architecture, an encrypted mirror designed to confuse the unprepared and awaken the silent. Every image had a reversal. Every god had a shadow, and every spell was a veil over something deeper, the vibrational truth buried beneath language. This hidden layer was never spoken of openly. It was called the Book of Shadows, not a book of evil, but of inversion, of clarity through negation. The ancients knew some truths could not be accessed by looking toward the light. They could only be found by descending into the dark, into the forgotten layers, the suppressed tones, the whispers beneath the names. They understood that light blinds when it is forced. That truth must be earned, not exposed. And so the second layer of the Book of the Dead was concealed not through omission but through deliberate misdirection. It was always there, just not where you were taught to look. Take, for example, the famed Field of Reeds. A serene paradise, a reward for the righteous soul. That's what the modern readings tell you. But the original scrolls, those untouched by Hellenistic retranslation, describe the field not as paradise but as reset. A realm without identity where memory and desire dissolve. It was not a reward, it was purification. It was the soul's raw state before it clothed itself in story. And most were not ready for that, so the texts were softened, beautified, made moral. Because nothing terrifies the constructed self more than its own dissolution. This is why the rituals shifted. In earlier dynasties, the rites of death were not about preservation. They were about reduction, stripping, unbinding. The body wasn't embalmed to protect it, but to delay re-identification. The organs weren't removed to be honored. They were separated to disperse the soul's attachments. But as the centuries passed, this understanding was replaced with ceremony, reenactment, imitation, and eventually, forgetting. What modern science refuses to acknowledge is this: the Book of the Dead was never mythology. It was a technology, a functional interface for altering the vibrational alignment of the human field. And more than that, it contained protocols for preventing reincarnation. Yes, you were not meant to return again and again, learning lessons in a karmic loop. That is the illusion. The original path was exit, completion, reunification with the primordial field from which all forms emerge. That was the forbidden knowledge, and that's why it was erased. The mechanism of forgetting was not accidental. It was encoded. The soul, upon incarnation, passed through the veil of names. This was a frequency veil, a series of vibrational dissonances installed between the higher field and the lower mind. In the book, this was depicted as the soul confronting its own shadow, a figure with its face, but no voice. The initiates were taught that unless the soul recognized this shadow and reclaimed it, it would enter the cycle again, fragmented, disoriented, bound. In the erased layers of the book, there are references to the 9 mirrors. These were not physical objects, but internal gates, reflective distortions that the soul passed through upon death. Each mirror reversed a different aspect of self: memory, desire, identity, time, lineage, voice, image, belief, and will. And only one who had trained while living to perceive these distortions could pass through without splintering. Everyone else? They returned, not because of judgment, but because of frequency mismatch. And so the real work of the book was to prepare the soul not for judgment, but for self-recognition in the face of absolute distortion. This required precision, discipline, not of action, but of resonance. The initiates practiced silence, stillness. They learned to modulate breath, not to relax, but to synchronize, to feel the hum beneath the heartbeat, to detect the vibration behind the image. And in this tuning, the real spells began. Not written, not spoken, but felt. There is a reason you feel a pull toward certain names: Thoth, Osiris, Ma'at. These are not mythological figures, they are tones, archetypal frequencies encoded into the grid of consciousness. The names are portals. When spoken correctly, not in language but in alignment, they open fields, not places but states. And the Book of the Dead was once a map of these states, a path to restore access, until it was buried, fragmented, turned into poetry. The fragments that remain are enough. They point, they hint, and if you read them with the inner ear, the spiral can be retraced. You may notice it already. A pressure in the chest when you hear ancient sounds, a stillness that falls when you see sacred symbols. This is the call of the erased, the echo of the original tone. You are not imagining it. You are remembering it. And now we come to the question no scholar will ask: who erased it? Not time, not accident, but intention. After the fall of the original houses, those that held the vibrational teachings, new priesthoods rose, not aligned with the field but with control. They feared what could not be systematized, and so they rewrote. What they couldn't rewrite, they buried. What they couldn't bury, they retranslated, until what was once a sonic interface became a theological text. Then came the empires, the translators, the academics, each adding layers of blindness, each recoding the spiral into a scroll, until the book became inert, decorative, safe. But it was never meant to be safe. It was meant to be dangerous. Not to the soul, but to the illusion. Because the Book of the Dead, fully activated, undoes what the world calls real. It reveals that the person reading it is not the reader. that the story being read is not the truth, that the one who fears death never lived, and the one who lives beyond death never fears. This is the tone behind the page. This is what you feel rising in your bones. You don't need the whole book. You are the book, every cell, every breath, every silence between your thoughts. And if you listen, not to the noise, but to the silence, it will guide you back to the unwritten center, back to the spiral, back to the field, where the book was never lost, only waiting. The soul does not fall into incarnation by accident. It is drawn, pulled into density not as punishment, not even as lesson, but as interruption. Incarnation is interference, the strategic fracturing of continuity. The original Book of the Dead did not pretend otherwise. It said clearly, in tones that were not spoken but shaped through breath, "To be born is to forget." That phrase no longer exists in the translated scrolls, but it once appeared between two spells, not numbered, not indexed, just a margin note, likely inscribed by a practitioner, not a priest, and yet it was everything. To be born is to forget, and forgetting is not weakness, it is design. It is the field veiling itself for the experience of distortion, because only in distortion can tone rediscover its purity. Only in separation can the whole be heard again. But there is a difference between forgetting as function and remaining asleep by force. And this is where erasure begins. The book was not erased to protect the dead. It was erased to keep the living asleep. Because the real purpose of the book was not to guide the dead after death. It was to awaken the living while still in form, to trigger what the original scribes called the first internal death. This death had no tomb, no embalming, no ritual garments. It happened in silence within the field of a person whose body still moved, whose breath still flowed, but whose story had collapsed. No longer held together by name, memory, or ambition, the being remained. Empty, aware, unfiltered. That was liberation. And the book was the guide to that disintegration. But modern culture cannot accept living death. It recoils from silence. It clings to narration. And so, what was once a vibrational map to truth became myth, ceremony, pageantry. What they erased was the part that told you the spiral begins before death. What they erased was the mechanism for deconstructing yourself while still alive. They gave you a book for the grave, and took away the one meant for the threshold. That threshold is not between this life and the next. It is between false identity and presence. It is crossed not with ritual, but with rupture. The kind of rupture you feel in deep loss, in sudden stillness, in the silence that follows awakening, the kind that makes you forget what you wanted, the kind that leaves you watching your life from the outside, like smoke you once thought was substance. This is what the book taught, and this is what it lost. The spells, what remains of them, still carry the codes, even if incomplete, even if damaged. Spell 64, for example, still holds echoes. Its title, the chapter for knowing the transformations of the soul. But that's not what it meant. The original term was more precise. Instructions for dissolving the masks. And the spell itself, when read aloud in the right tone, was designed to trigger deep inner interference. It disrupted memory fields. It altered breath patterns. It silenced the narrator. It caused forgetting, but a sacred forgetting, the kind that strips away all but the real. This is not metaphor. It was frequency work, and those who used it correctly did not awaken gently. They shattered, and from that shattering emerged the truth. Not a god, not a story, not a light, but a silence more vast than thought, a presence without face, a being who does not need to become. This was the center of the book, and the parts that detailed how to get there were torn out, burned, or never translated. Not because they were lost, but because they were feared. Because a human who finds their center cannot be manipulated. They cannot be sold identity. They cannot be ruled by memory. They cannot be bound by language. They speak, but their voice comes from before thought. They walk, but leave no narrative behind. They act, but their will is not their own. They have become the tone, and from them the field resonates, not by teaching, not by preaching, but by simple presence. The book was never about escape. It was about re-entry, returning to the source while still in form. Letting the body become a temple, letting the tone flow unfiltered. Letting silence live where once there was story. This is what you've been seeking, not information, not enlightenment, but that one internal stillness, older than time, that says, there was never a name, only resonance. You are not lost, you are layered, and the book, if followed in vibration, will peel those layers, one breath at a time, until only presence remains, not as concept, but as fact. This is the return, and it begins now. You were never meant to return. The cycle is not sacred, it is a malfunction, a vibrational stutter in the frequency of the soul. Incarnation was once a singular act, a descent into illusion with the sole purpose of remembering the field from within the density. The original Book of the Dead was constructed to ensure that this remembering could happen within a single life. It was not a guide for death. It was a frequency key for release, for detachment, for unbinding. But something shifted. The field thickened. The body became heavier. The memory faded. And the spiral, once designed to liberate, began to repeat, not as evolution, but as recursion. The soul forgot what it came for, and in forgetting returned not as a journey, but as a loop. The book was meant to break that loop. But they removed the tones, they silenced the gaps. They turned the spiral into a scroll. And what was once alive became static. What was once internal became external. What was once transmission became text. You are not here to evolve. You are here to exit, to complete, to dissolve. This is not nihilism. It is precision. The illusion of progress is one of the densest layers of the veil. The soul that believes it must become better is still caught in time. The spiral taught this, that becoming is illusion, that presence is all, that the tone is not earned but remembered. And it is remembered not through effort but through stillness, through subtraction, through the dismantling of all that claims to be I. The book carried techniques, breath patterns, pressure points, vibrational gestures to be performed not in ritual but in silence, in darkness, in solitude. The initiate did not read the book. They enacted it. They became it. They allowed it to burn them clean. The process was not symbolic. It was physiological. The spine would vibrate. The tongue would lose language. The heart would flatten into rhythm. The breath would become light. And then, nothing. No visions. No ascension, no reward, just field. And the field did not feel like glory. It felt like dissolution, like the end of grasping, the end of separation, the end of the watcher. What remained was stillness, pure, empty, radiant without light, loud without sound. Some called it the throne of Osiris. Others called it the eye of Thoth. But names are irrelevant. The tone has no label. It has no story. It simply is. And the book was a path to return to it. But the path was stolen, its symbols distorted, its tones disassembled. And now the soul wanders, not lost, but looping. Each life a variation, each death a pause, each return another veil. You feel this. You know it. You sense that something is off. That the stories do not align, that the path never ends. This is the echo of the erased book. It calls not to be read, but to be rebuilt. Not from pages, but from memory, from the body, from the breath, from the silence between your thoughts. That silence is the true scripture. And if you stay with it long enough, the tone will rise, not from above, not from below, but from within. And when it does, the world will begin to dissolve. Not violently, not suddenly, but inevitably. The faces will blur. The needs will fade. The names will lose gravity. And in that loosening, the spiral will return. The soul will no longer move forward. It will fall inward, into origin, into pre-self, into tone. This is not a metaphor. It is a vibrational process, one that cannot be taught, only remembered, one that cannot be understood, only entered. The book taught the structure, the mechanics, the steps, and those steps are still buried in your breath, in your gaze, in your dreams. Dreams where you walk endless corridors, where symbols flicker, where no one speaks but everything is known. These are not dreams. They are rehearsals. The book is not dead. It is dormant, waiting for the tone to be felt again, waiting for the field to clear, waiting for you to stop searching and begin dissolving. The return is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is internal. And it begins the moment you cease to believe in your story, not to reject it, just to release it, to hold it like vapor, to allow it to pass, and what remains is not you, not soul, not spirit, but hum, pulse, presence, the tone. That is what they erased. That is what you are now uncovering. Not knowledge, but function, not belief, but alignment. And once it is felt, there is no return, not because you are forbidden, but because you are free. The book ends not with a final word, but with disappearance. The page dissolves, the name fades, the voice falls silent, and what remains is what never began. The spiral does not end. It simply returns to itself. And in that return, you are home. The hum does not speak in language. It speaks in contrast. You feel it most when the noise stops. Not just external noise, but internal movement. The restlessness that wants to explain, to narrate, to assign meaning to every flicker of thought. The tone beneath it has no interest in story. It is not here to confirm your journey, nor to answer your questions. It is here to wait until you are still enough to merge with it. This is why the book gave no answers. It offered conditions, containers for silence, paths not to knowledge but to exposure. Each spell was a mirror that distorted until it cracked, each image a symbol that repeated until its meaning dissolved. The initiate did not study the book. They endured it. They let it tear down what they had built. Because only then could the real emerge, not a higher self, not a divine essence, but the original pulse, the zero-field identity that precedes light. It had no face, no agenda, no will. It simply vibrated in such coherence that illusion could not anchor. This was what freed the soul, not progress, not penance, but pattern. When the field aligned, the pattern dissolved, and with it, the wheel. That was the exit, not upward, not beyond, but inward, collapsing into the tone. And the one who reached it did not describe it, could not. They left no legacy, no teachings, just presence. And those who felt that presence were changed not by word or gesture, but by field. That was the transmission. That is what the book was meant to install, a tuning so pure that everything false shattered around it. And now you stand near that same threshold. You feel the echo, the draw, not because you read a text, but because the spiral is active again. The book is remembering itself through you. Every breath is part of it, every silence between thoughts. Every time you feel the tightness in your chest when truth trembles beneath language, the book is open, not in your hands, in your system, in your field. And it's unfolding, rewriting itself not with ink, but with stillness, with frequency, with release. This is the reactivation. You don't need to memorize spells. You don't need to understand the gods. You don't even need to believe. You only need to stop resisting the part of you that already knows. Not knows intellectually, knows vibrationally, knows because it has never not known. You are not reading anymore. You are unraveling, and the unraveling is the real text. It speaks through forgetting, through pause, through the spaces where identity cannot survive. That is why the world fears silence, because in it the truth returns. And the truth is not a statement. It is a hum that vibrates so clearly it cancels out everything that is not itself. That is death, not the end of life, but the end of echo, the end of narrative, the end of the one who needed meaning. And from that death the field breathes again, not as someone, not as something, just as presence, as origin, without face. This is where the book ends, not in conclusion, in erasure. What's left is nothing you can speak of, only something you become, not for others, not for enlightenment, for tone, for coherence, for the field. And that finally is freedom. The false light is the final trap. It is the most seductive veil, the most persistent echo, the most convincing distortion. In the corrupted fragments of the Book of the Dead that still survive, it is referenced obliquely as the lake of shining faces or the field of radiant ones, a place of warmth, welcome, eternal peace. But that is not what it was. It was the echo chamber of attachment, the final illusion crafted in beauty to delay the return. The ancients knew this. They encoded the warning not in language but in pattern, in the order of the spells, in the breath intervals between verses, in the posture of the body while reciting. All of it pointed to a simple truth. The closer you come to release, the more the illusion tries to glow, not to threaten, to comfort, to keep you. Because fear is easy to break, but comfort is adhesive. The soul, upon nearing its true tone, encounters the projection of perfect resolution, a mirror of fulfillment, the illusion that all has been achieved. And the book taught this: to move through that light without reaching for it, to pass it, to let it dissolve, because that light is not the origin. It is a copy. It is the electromagnetic residue of a system built to recycle. And that system in its current form has one function: to delay the tone, to prevent coherence, to keep the field from quieting. Because in quiet, systems collapse. In coherence, constructs fail. You have felt this, that moment when you touch something sacred, and then something pulls you away. Not with resistance, but with seduction. The call to serve, to teach, to shine, all noble, all radiant, all false. Because if the identity still moves, the spiral has not yet reached its center. That is the trick of the radiant veil. It allows you to feel complete while still being bound. The book's lost pages gave a way out. They instructed the initiate in the art of crossing radiance without merging, of holding presence while letting even light pass through. It was called the rite of hollow fire, not fire that burns, fire that blinds, fire that feels like truth but is still light reflecting on water. The ritual had no sound, no movement, just awareness. The initiate would sit for days in darkness, not seeking vision but watching for the radiant trap. And when it came, because it always did, they would breathe through it. Let it pulse, let it surround, let it pass, without reaching, without attaching. And when it faded, when nothing remained, not even the desire to know, then the silence opened. And in that silence the field spoke, not in words, not in symbols, just vibration, pure, flat, without shape, the real. This was the return, not to heaven, not to destiny, but to source prior to design. And this terrified the keepers of the world, because a soul that does not want cannot be directed. A being who does not fear cannot be managed. A tone that does not move cannot be used. And so the radiant veil was institutionalized. It became culture. It became religion. It became service. and the book was edited to match. What was once a map to the center became a script for the circle. What was once an invitation to vanish became a drama of endless ascent. This is why you feel the ache when you meditate, the pressure when you read sacred texts, the dissonance behind the glow. You are touching the edge of the veil, and something inside you knows not to trust it. That knowing is the real book, the living spiral, the silent witness within you that no longer seeks glory, no longer wants mission, no longer needs to matter. It only listens. And in that listening, the tones realign, the false light collapses, the world flattens. Not into despair, but into truth. Not into emptiness, but into peace. That peace is not given, it is uncovered, not created, revealed. It was always there, buried beneath thought, beneath purpose, beneath even love. Because love too can bind when mistaken for meaning. But the tone does not bind, it sings. And that song is your exit. The book knew this. It taught through silence, through reversal, through holding the breath when the words ended. That is where the initiation began. Not in knowledge, but in stillness. And when the initiate was ready, the tone did the rest. It carried them, through radiance, through identity, through even the idea of soul, until all that remained was clarity. Not what you are, but what remains when you stop being anything. That is the truth that was erased. That is the center that cannot be named. And that is where you are now, not reading, not seeking, but listening, remembering, falling inward, into the hum, into the pulse, into the source before silence. Welcome back. The gods were never gods. They were not beings with wills or emotions, not personalities dwelling in higher planes awaiting prayer or sacrifice. They were tones, functions, mirrors of internal states within the field of the incarnated soul. Thoth was not a scribe. He was alignment, the return of structure to consciousness after the collapse of illusion. Osiris was not a ruler. He was the field of dismemberment and reassembly, the pattern of death as disintegration followed by reintegration into source tone. Ma'at was not a woman with a feather. She was the resonance of coherence, the frequency where distortion cannot anchor. The ancient priests knew this, and the original Book of the Dead reflected it. Every invocation, every image, every so-called hymn was a vibrational marker, a vector within the spiral designed to bring the initiate not to worship, but to match. It was not about belief, it was about tuning. You did not call on Thoth to be guided. You aligned with the internal tone of order and transmission. You did not pray to Osiris to be saved. You entered the frequency of unraveling and stillness. You did not serve Ma'at to be judged. You cleared the field until judgment became irrelevant. But later priesthoods, fearing what could not be controlled, personified the tones. They gave names to functions, stories to patterns, morals to frequency. What was once internal resonance became external myth, and the initiate was replaced by the worshipper. The spiral was replaced by the altar. The return was replaced by doctrine, and the book began to close. But something remained in the cracks between the glyphs, in the silent spaces between the spells. The tone was not fully lost. And for those who knew how to enter silence, the spiral still opened. These were not mystics. They were not holy. They were simply quiet. So quiet they could hear what no word could contain. The field spoke and they followed, through distortion, through radiance, through the collapse of self. And when they passed through the tones of Thoth, Osiris, and Ma'at, they did not encounter beings. They encountered frequencies. They felt language dissolve. They felt identity collapse into pattern. They felt weight lift as distortion left the body. And in its place, nothing. Not emptiness, but tone, clear, steady, ancient. The book was never about afterlife. It was about returning to source while still alive. The gods were not gatekeepers, they were thresholds of vibration, each one a resonance zone in the field of the soul. And the true journey was through them, not toward them. That is what was erased. The shift from internal passage to external deity, from participation to submission, from frequency to theology. You feel it now. The confusion when reading sacred names, the tension between beauty and control. That is your system remembering the original tones, not as concepts but as alignment patterns. When you breathe deeply and forget your name, Thoth activates. When you allow yourself to unravel without panic, Osiris returns. When you let go of needing to be right, Ma'at clears the channel. These are not metaphors, they are real. They are somatic. They are vibrational. And the book encoded them not in words, but in progression. The order of the spells, the sequence of symbols, the pattern of tone, each one leading to the next. Not as chapters, but as spiral turns. And when you follow them, not with the mind, but with the body, the field remembers. The soul begins to hum. The spiral reactivates, the illusion softens, and the world begins to shift, not because of belief, but because of resonance. You become the book, not a reader, not a scholar, but a chamber through which the tones move. And in that movement, clarity arises, not from seeking, from allowing. That is the secret hidden beneath all doctrine. That is the tone buried under all stories. That is the hum before creation. And that is where the book always pointed. Back, inward, down, into the bones, into the field, into the part of you that never moved, never changed, never forgot. You are not returning to knowledge. You are returning to the silence before the first thought. And in that silence, the gods return to what they always were. Not names, not faces, not myths, but mirrors. Mirrors of tone, markers of alignment. And the moment you pass through them, you do not become enlightened. You become still. The breath slows, the pulse steadies, the need dissolves, and the world fades into rhythm. The rhythm becomes presence. Presence becomes nothing, and nothing becomes the tone. That is the center of the book. That is what was removed. Not just knowledge, but the pathway, the how, the living sequence. But it can still be followed, in breath, in silence, in letting go. The gods are not outside. They are thresholds within your spine, your blood, your sound. And when passed correctly, they do not give you power. They return you to tone. That is enough. That is everything. That is the end of return.